Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the Strangeland podcast. I'm your host, Stefan, and I'm here today, as always, with my co-host, Kenny.
What's up, everybody? Yeah, we took like a month off for July, and just for some personal time off. In the foreseeable future, that shouldn't happen again. But as promised, we are back today with episode 19.
Yeah, it was a nice little break, I have to say. We're rested, we're ready to get back at it. Before we start, I did want to mention a couple things. Shout out to everybody who sent us emails. We've gotten a slew of really, really nice emails lately. So thanks to everybody who supported the show. I just want to make sure that I said that at the top. So thanks, guys. Seriously. Also in our emails, we're getting a lot of requests for different cases, and I wanted to let everyone know that we definitely are working on them. We sort of had a list planned out, so once we finish with our list, then we'll start to work on the fan-requested shows. Actually, next week, we're going to do Hinterkaifeck, which is a pretty big case, but it's been requested by a ton of people who have emailed us. So
the Hinterkaifeck murders.
Yes. We're gonna start working on that as soon as possible, and a few other fan submissions too. So be on the lookout for that.
Awesome, and I want to give a special shout out to Brenda. We had a very lengthy email conversation about our Darlie Routier case. And shout out to you, because that was a pretty interesting conversation. I always love receiving emails, good, bad emails. It's pretty awesome. So, again, our email is thestrangelandpodcast@gmail.com. Send us any type of emails you want to send us, and we will have a conversation about whatever you want.
Yeah, definitely. So in today's episode, we are going to talk about the Butcher Baker of Anchorage, Alaska, more commonly known as Robert Christian Hansen. And this guy, without saying, he's a character. He was known to basically lure his victims, who were mostly sex workers and strippers, and he would offer these girls money or all sorts of different stuff, take them out to lunch, but then he would essentially kidnap them, rape them, do a number of horrible things.
And he would find strippers coming out of the strip club and offer them money for sexual acts. So it's, so I think he would pick up actual sex workers, but he would also pick up, strippers that I don't believe were sex workers necessarily, but
Right.
He would just entice them with money for sexual acts and then get them in the car and then go from there.
So one of the most shocking things that I actually learned while researching this case was how easily this guy was able to avoid detection from police, and for how long. I mean, he wasn't like a BTK who was running around for 30 years, but this guy had a good 10, 12, 15-year spree. I mean, we don't really know for sure.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting how I don't really want to use the word typical, but he just reminds me of a lot of other serial killers. He reminds me of the Green River Killer.
Yeah.
He reminds me of he is pretty typical. He's like this middle-aged white man who is preying on sex workers, and he just looks the part too.
Sure.
And a lot of his friends, he was kind of a socially awkward character, but he did have friends in real life. I think he had a family and stuff, and so or he's had wives at least.
Sure.
And so he was kind of a really normal-ish guy who's just a little bit socially awkward.
Right, and that's how he was able to go undetected. He was just the baker. Just a guy that was the police glanced right over him. I mean, a few times, honestly.
Exactly. Yeah, he was right underneath their noses for many years.
It's funny that you mention the Green River Killer, because at first they thought it was the Green River
Yeah.
Killer doing these murders as well.
Yeah, I mean, his MO is very similar to the Green River Killers, and where they found the bodies, some of the bodies at least, were pretty much similar to how the Green River Killer would get rid of bodies.
Right, definitely. I mean, on banks of water,
Exactly.
that sort of situation.
So, Robert Christian Hansen was born in Easterville, Iowa in 1939 to two Danish immigrant parents. His father, Christian Hansen, was a baker and was known to have been very religious and a very strict enforcer. And this is something else. I mean, this is something you see
Time and time again.
obviously.
Man. How many times have we mentioned this already? Like at least every other episode, maybe.
Exactly, and you see it all the time. And you watched Mindhunters, right? On
No, I actually haven't seen it.
Well, on Mindhunters, this is not spoiling anything for anyone, but because they have what's his name? He's
Ed Kemper.
Ed Kemper on there, and he mentions this because Ed Kemper's mother was very demeaning towards him,
Right.
and he says something about if a mother humiliates her son, it will have bad influences on the rest of his life, and it's the same thing with fathers as well.
Totally. Even Catherine Knight, remember that? I mean, she was abused by her. She had a terrible childhood.
Yeah, exactly. She may have been one of the worst people we've covered so far.
True.
Seriously. So Hansen would work at his father's bakery starting at an early age, making only 35 cents a day. And I don't know, back in the day, maybe that wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
And he was an only child, and he was forced to help the family make money. From an early age, Hansen was labeled as a social outcast. He was very skinny, and he suffered from extreme acne, which caused girls to tease him, damaging his self-esteem very early on in his life. Hansen once described his face as one giant pimple. He was also heavily bullied because of this.
Yeah, not shockingly, Hansen hated school and found other activities such as hunting and hiking to be more of his liking. Anything where he could sort of be alone and be at peace and not have to worry about people. Hansen really felt at home, and it's said that Hansen was born a lefty. And this is fucking crazy because I'm a lefty and it's so weird to think that this would happen so much back in the day, but they would actually make you change hands for whatever reason. It's still unclear to me why.
Well, this seems I didn't do a lot of research on this. I should have because it's in the notes, but I think that's a religious thing.
Is it?
I don't know. I feel like it is. I feel like
left-handed is the mark of the devil.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard that at some point in the past.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I could be wrong. People don't
let us know if you guys
let us know. Don't scream at us. But I think that has something to do with it. I think it has some religious undertones.
Well, now me being left-handed makes a lot more sense. I have to say that. So, I mean, anyway, when his father found out he was left-handed when the school told him, they then forced him to use his right hand. And this is weird. Hansen explains that this worsened the stutter he already had.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the thing is he had this stutter because it's like he was nervous around everyone. He wasn't very comfortable, and I think that can sometimes produce a stutter in young children. And this obviously made it much worse. Now he has to focus on going from writing with his left hand, which was comfortable, to doing something extremely uncomfortable, like writing with his right hand. So I can kind of see how that would have influence on his, already stutter.
Yeah, especially if your dad is screaming down your throat,
Exactly.
forcing you to change. So in 1957, Hansen graduated from high school. In his senior year high school yearbook, his name was actually misspelled. And this sort of just gives a little bit more credence to the fact that he wasn't really a popular kid and he thrived in the background. I mean, no one really got to know him all too well, honestly. Now, this trait that I mentioned, him able to slip into the background, that sort of trait in a person, seemed very bad for him during his younger years, but it's this exact trait that would actually help him evade and stay undetected for the amount of time that he did.
Yeah, and of course that's something else that you see in a lot of people. I mean, a lot of them are sort of social outcasts that learn how to blend in, and
Totally.
like you said, that allows them to blend into the cops or from the cops as well.
Right.
So after graduation, Hansen joined the Army Reserves and began his basic training at Fort Dix in New Jersey. Once Hansen joined the army, he also experienced his first sexual encounter with sex workers, bringing them back to the hotel room. 2 years later, after leaving the army, Hansen would return to his father's bakery in Iowa, where he worked. And during this time, Hansen would try out a few jobs, such as working for the military police and attempting to be a drill instructor for the junior police. And how he would be a drill instructor with
Yeah,
his.
I can't see that, man.
Yeah, I don't really see that.
It's weird too. I guess we should also mention in Iowa, as you said earlier, his father was a baker, and his father, whatever people thought of Robert Hansen, he was pretty much accepted in Iowa because his father was a man of stature. I guess he had status in the community. He was the baker, really well known, and from what I can tell, a pretty well liked guy. So.
Mhm. So in 1960, Hansen would meet his first wife, and the two were married. However, this marriage would not last for very long. And during this time, Hansen would be arrested for setting fire to a school bus garage with his 16-year-old friend. So I guess like a garage that holds all the school buses.
Yeah,
Right?
a
Okay.
bus barn.
Bus barn. Okay, so so he set it on fire with his 16-year-old friend because of perceived abuses made by the people of Pocahontas, Iowa.
This is so weird. It's already like
Which-
paranoid.
Yeah, which is where he lived
actions.
at the time. Yeah, exactly. So he's worried about people, these perceived abuses from the people that in the town that he lived in.
Right, and he's well out of high school. What is he doing burning down? Like, it's like, dude, at this time, he was 19 years old when he had burned that, the bus warehouse, if you will,
Yeah.
down. But it just seems weird. It's like he was really holding on to some sort of, I don't know, ill will towards the people already.
Yeah, definitely, and maybe something for school as well. I mean, it's a school bus
Right.
barn or whatever. So the 16-year-old, his friend, felt bad about the act and turned himself in as well as Robert. Hansen was sentenced to 3 years in prison, and he would only end up serving 20 months for this and would be released. And interestingly enough, when Hansen committed this arson, he was working as a volunteer firefighter. During his incarceration, his wife would leave him, which is probably for the better.
It's also interesting to mention here. You said he was a volunteer firefighter earlier. So once he burnt the bus barn down, he was actually able to just finish watching it, right? Because he was a firefighter. So he got to go and just watch it all burn to the ground, essentially, which I guess for him would bring some sort of pleasure. He was pretty mad, so
Huh.
it works out that he got to stick around and see it all go down.
Yeah, he got to watch his creation burn to the ground.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you mentioned that her leaving him was probably for the better. I couldn't agree more. As soon as he got incarcerated, she was pretty much like, "Fuck this, I'm out. I am not doing this." But either way, in 1963, Hansen met Darla Marley Hendrickson, and the two would get married. So he's on to a second wife at this point. And once they get married, they pretty much right away moved to Anchorage, Alaska, and that's in 1967. So, I mean, maybe not right away, 4 years later, but soon after, nonetheless. And Darla was a very deep religious woman. At a certain point, she had knew what she was getting herself into when she had married Hansen. She knew about his arrest for arson, and she had still stood by him, and she thought she could bring him closer to God. And so the family would regularly attend church in an attempt to get Robert on the right track. I think it worked. Maybe she believed that it would help. I mean, but I mean, we're talking about them today. So
Yeah, so obviously in the long run, it did not work at all.
exactly. Now, while in Anchorage, Hansen would spend a lot of time in the wilderness, and because of this, he was able to really hone his hunting skills, becoming known around town as a master hunter, and even actually submitting some trophies to Pope and Young's hunting club. And he set a world record 2 years in a row. And he had a few trophy animals that he submitted in, more than two, but he set a world record at least two in a row.
Yeah, and something else. Yeah, something else with this hunting. He became a very skilled hunter, like you said, and hunting in Alaska and in this area, if he's out doing it all the time, he's out in the wilderness all the time hunting. That gives him an advantage, I think, over basically anyone else who isn't out there all the time, because now he has learned these woods.
Oh, totally.
So he knows a lot about this area in the wilderness in this area, so he kind of knows where everything's at. He knows ways in and out, and yeah, I think that is a real big advantage for him.
Yeah, not only that, it's such a harsh landscape as well. We're talking bears. We're talking, it's Alaska. It's
It's
freaking
Alaska,
cold.
yeah. It's
So
super cold, and
exactly.
yeah.
Now, in 1977, he was arrested for stealing a chainsaw and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now, after a customary mental evaluation, the prison psychiatrist concluded that Hansen suffered from bipolar disorder and requested to the courts that he be put on lithium in order to control his mood swings. Regardless, the order was never actually enforced, and Hansen was released just after serving 1 year. He was out.
So now he's been in prison twice, right? The first time for arson, and now this for theft.
Right.
It's pretty interesting, actually, that he got 5 years for stealing a chainsaw.
He also got caught for assaulting young women early on in life, too. He had a rape charge.
Yeah, that was in Iowa, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And so in the 1980s, Alaska would gain a significantly bigger population when the Alaskan oil pipeline started its construction. Tons of blue-collar workers would head to the snowy wilderness looking for jobs and trying to find their niche and take advantage of the economic boom. And due to the heavy amount of people that came to the Anchorage area, a lot of bars and strip clubs popped up to offer patrons a relaxing evening. Hansen would also frequent these places as well. His wife even admits that she knew he was up to no good, and later explained it wasn't uncommon for him to be at such places late at night. However, what he was actually doing would be unknown to her, and far worse than just hanging out at strip clubs late at night. And just hanging out at strip clubs late at night and hanging out at bars and stuff is probably too much for his wife, because, like you said earlier, she was a deeply religious woman, so I'm sure she didn't even like that, but she didn't know that that was the tip of the iceberg.
Right. And actually, his wife is sort of an interesting piece of this puzzle. I think they had a really interesting relationship. I think she pretty much knew, even though she stuck by him, right? She was religious, and I think that's what kept her hanging on. But she knew that there was something wrong with this guy. She just couldn't leave him. And they really didn't even spend all that much time together in perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that, the Anchorage, Alaska area was sort of booming due to this pipeline being built. And I really think it's important that we hit home on here and really paint the picture of what it was like to be in Anchorage in the 70s. I mean, this place was a real rough and tumble sort of place, These people were hard workers who flooded the area in order to construct this pipeline. And I hope that at least gives you an idea of the sort of people that were headed to this area.
Well, yeah, and Alaska wasn't founded until 1959,
Right.
as a state. So this is only, a little more. I mean, this is in the 80s, in the late 70s, early 80s. So it's not even 2 decades later.
Right.
And so, before this, there were a lot of Army, bases in Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't really, there weren't a lot of people there to begin with. So, yeah, I mean, it's still booming. And like you said, in the 70s, this is like Anchorage is the biggest city in Alaska, unless
Totally.
I'm mistaken. So even then, it wasn't. It was still like this frontier town, right? That's still getting a population boom.
Oh, yeah. And, Hansen would take advantage of this economic boom in more than one way. In January 1981, Hansen opened a bakery using the money he received from a false insurance claim. He said his house was robbed and they had taken like trophies, which are essentially, they were like, it was taxidermy. It was like heads, mounted heads, and he had insured them. And like I said earlier, he said that they went missing. And just a little bit more background here. These trophies were later found by Hansen. But yeah, in his backyard nonetheless.
Yeah, and he never reported the recovery of the items, right?
Right. He collected
Yeah.
the money and he used to put that towards an airplane.
Yeah, and the bakery, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So the business would end up being fairly profitable, and Hansen, just a year later, would be able to purchase a Piper Super Cub. Sorry, like Stefan just said, it's a small plane that he would use. I mean, a lot of people in Alaska have these small planes to get from one. There are a lot of places in Alaska that you can't get to unless you have a plane, like Nome.
Right.
And so Hansen's wife would later explain that the couple did not mix their money. And she was a tutor and supposedly paid for all the household bills, and he would keep all the profits from the bakery separate from her earnings. And I don't know how truthful that is, because that seems kind of weird that she would make enough money to support all of them on a tutor's salary. But that is the word.
Yeah. So we mentioned earlier Anchorage was host to a new rough and tumble blue collar class, and because of this brought a lot of bars and strip clubs alike. Now, it was commonplace for a strip club to have a completely different working staff every 6 months. I mean, the turnarounds in these places were super, super high. They could not keep anyone working there. Dancers and sex workers, for that matter, would move around quite a bit, and it wasn't uncommon for a girl just to up and leave and head somewhere else. Now, because of this, there were very many missing reports that were basically sent out to the police wondering where these girls would go, and because of the nature of the jobs they were working, police don't really pay attention to it. They're sort of like, well, we're going to err on the side of they just got out of here and up and left.
Yeah, and it's interesting because again, this is in the late '70s, early '80s, and with the case on the Green River Killer, it was the same thing with that. It was like there wasn't a lot of public outcry to catch the serial killer in that case because he was killing sex workers, and it seemed like the public just didn't care enough, and that's pretty unfortunate.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it seems weird, but I guess I can understand how they were overlooked in the first place. And who knows what the crime was in Alaska. I'm sure they were dealing with quite a few things. But even still.
Exactly. And so in 1980, the body of a woman was found near a series of power lines on Eklutna Road. I could have butchered that word. But to this day, her identity is still a mystery, but she was dubbed as Eklutna Annie. An autopsy report concluded that she had been killed by a stab wound to the back. The body was in very bad condition and was theorized to have been eaten by bears. Remember, in wilderness Alaska, there are grizzlies everywhere.
Yeah.
So it's, not uncommon for this to happen.
Yeah, I should mention too, like, other than these power lines, there is literally a road and nothing else. It is wilderness straight up. So, and the body was actually found by hunters.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that same year, the body of a local topless dancer, Joanne Messina, was found buried in a shallow gravel pit. Her body was also in, pretty bad condition, which made it very difficult to gather evidence. The last time Joanne had been seen alive was about 6 months prior to her body being found. On September 12th, 1982, two off-duty Anchorage police officers, they spent an afternoon hunting along the Nick River. Is it Knik or Nick, do you think?
We'll say Nick.
Nick
but
River.
It's probably Knik,
Knik,
I'm
right.
sure.
The two men had little luck hunting, and as darkness began to fall, they decided to call it a day. The walk back to camp was not that easy, of course, but both men were familiar with the area and decided to take a shortcut across a sandbar. However, as they progressed up the river, they noticed a boot sticking out of the sand.
So, upon closer inspection, the two men were taken aback. Sticking out of the sand was a partially decomposed bone joint. Both men backed up from the scene. The last thing they wanted to do was disturb or contaminate any evidence. Again, these guys were cops. They weren't trying, they knew exactly what they had found when they stumbled upon it, and they weren't about to mess up the crime scene in any way, which thank God for that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after making note of the location, both men made their way back to their camp and spent the night. Now, Sergeant Raleigh Port was assigned to cover this investigation. You know, I guess I really do want to mention here, too, these guys were in the middle of nowhere when they stumbled upon this body. So they can't even go and tell police right away. They have to mark it on their map, walk all the way back to their camp, spend the night, and then wake up in the morning, get to their car, make it to the police station, and then report it.
Exactly.
But either way, as I said earlier, Sergeant Raleigh Port was assigned to cover this investigation. Now, he was a decorated Vietnam veteran, and he was considered one of the top investigators by the force. He was very meticulous with every crime scene and was known to spend hours going over the smallest details. And before disturbing the body, when he arrived, he had photographs taken from every single angle and carefully examined the body itself for any traces of evidence that it may have been holding. Now, afterwards, he pulled out a large screen and began sifting through the sand close and around the perimeter of the body. It took several hours for them to finish sifting, but this actually would end up paying off. So lying in the screen was a single shell from a .223 caliber bullet. Now, back in Anchorage, a preliminary autopsy revealed that the victim was a female of undetermined age and had been dead for approximately 6 months. The cause of death was 3 gunshot wounds from the .223 bullets. Ace bandages were found mingled in with the remains, causing investigators to suspect that the victim had been blindfolded sometime before the time of death. It took a little over 2 weeks to finally identify the body as that of 24-year-old Sherry Morrow, a dancer from the Wild Cherry Bar in downtown Anchorage. She was last seen on November 17th, 1981, and according to friends, she was going to see a man that offered her $300 to pose for some pictures, and that was the last thing they had ever heard from her.
So, on the night of June 13th, 1983, a truck driver, and really just a pickup truck, was passing through town when he was flagged down by a frantic young female waving her arms and calling out to him. The girl, who would later be identified as Cindy Paulson, had a pair of handcuffs dangling from one of her wrists, and her clothing was disheveled. I think she had like a shirt on, maybe, but she didn't have pants, so she was in her panties, and so she was like halfway clothed, halfway not. So she told the man in the truck that a man was after her and asked him to take her to the Big Timber Motel. He took her and dropped her off at the Big Timber Motel, and the police, the Anchorage Police Department was called, and the incident was reported. When Anchorage police officer Greg Baker arrived at the Big Timber Motel, he found the girl alone and still in handcuffs. Once he removed the cuffs, she began telling him what happened to her. According to reports she gave to investigators, she had been approached on the street by a 40-ish, red-haired man and offered $200 for oral sex.
That's a pretty high price. That was not the going rate in Anchorage, Alaska. So he was given good money.
Yeah, right. Which is, that's just a way of. I think other people did this too. It's like
sure, coax them.
Yeah, exactly. Say, well, I have this much for you, and hopefully they believe you. But it should be a red flag. But I guess you don't really think about that at the time.
Yeah.
So she agreed to the price, but midway through the act, the man locked a handcuff around her wrist and pulled out a gun. He told her if she cooperated, he would not kill her. He then drove to his house in an upper-class area not far from town, and the gun was a 223 caliber.
It was.
Was it a revolver with a wood handle?
Yep.
Cool. So yeah, he pulled out the gun, took her to his home, and yeah.
Now, once inside, the man brutally raped her, bit her nipples, and at one point even shoved a hammer into her vagina. I mean, this guy is fucked, to say the least. He's terrible. After a brief rest, the man said he was going to fly her to his cabin in the mountains and told her that he would let her go if she cooperated. Again, like he keeps saying this, and we see this with a lot of serial killers too. The control aspect is really strong with this guy. He loved to control people.
I mean, that's all it is. Like when you really come down, like when you really break it down to what it is at its core, it is pure control.
Right.
I mean, what is it that makes people kill, murder other people, serial killers, murder other people? It's control over a human's life.
Right, fantasizing about having complete dominance and control. Not every, but
Most of them.
yeah,
I mean,
a
I
big
think
percentage.
Yeah, I would say almost all of them. It's like it all boils down to control in the end.
And I think it's just messed up. This guy tortures this girl in his house, and then right after just takes a nap, and she's chained up to basically a beam. She can't move at all, and he just takes a nap on a couch right by her. So, and like I said, after he wakes up, he tells her that they're gonna fly to the cabin, and then he essentially drives her to the airport. And her kidnapper was basically shoving supplies into the plane, and the young girl knew she was in serious trouble, and that the man would probably kill her once she got to the cabin. Now, waiting until his back was turned, she shoved open the door and ran to her life. Now, according to her, he chased after her at first, but then relented when he saw her wave down the person driving the truck. And after he noticed that she got someone's attention, Hanson slowed his running down to a walk and then just abruptly turned around to get in his car.
Yeah, I mean, if all of that is very accurate, if it's like he was actually able to see her get to to wave down someone, I think it's pretty lucky on his end, but unfortunate in general that the driver of this truck didn't see the man that was coming after her.
Sure. And at that point, honestly, it was more about keeping her safe. After making a statement at police headquarters, investigators drove the young girl to Merrill Field, the airport where she had been taken. As they drove through the small airport, she spotted out the blue and white Piper Super Club. A check with the flight tower revealed that the plane belonged to Robert C. Hansen, who lived on Old Harbor Road.
You think he would have been smart enough to still fly the plane to the
Right.
place? Because like you can just imagine what she's going to go do, and you can imagine what exactly they're going to do, and they're going to bring her back to the airport. So.
Yeah, an interesting fact too, Hansen didn't even have his pilot license. So, and he would paint the numbers on his plane super small so the towers couldn't read it, and he would just give them other planes' numbers.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Now, after dropping the woman off at the hospital, Officer Baker and a group of fellow officers went directly to Hansen's house. Hansen became outraged when confronted with the woman's charges. He claimed that he had never met her and stated that she was probably just trying to shake him down for some money. And I quote, this is what he said to police, everybody. Quote, "You can't rape a prostitute, can you?" Unquote.
What does that even mean?
I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, of course, it's just insane. I can't believe the fucking gall of this guy is insane.
Yeah.
Hansen went on to state that his wife and 2 children were vacationing in Europe and said that he had spent the entire evening with 2 friends. And his alibi actually checked out and no formal charges were fired. He got 2 of his buddies to basically lie for him and say, yeah, oh yeah, he was with us that night. We were fixing an airplane seat. That's what they said. That was their alibi. They were working on an airplane seat because that's what you do in Alaska.
On September 2nd, 1983, just 10 days shy of the 1-year anniversary of discovering Sherry Morrow, another body was found along Knik River. Now we're saying Knik.
Yeah, we've changed.
I
It's
believe
okay.
I believe it's Knik. Could be Nick, but I think it's Knik. It's K-N-I-K. Sorry,
We're pronouncing
everybody.
the K.
Look, it's Alaska.
It's
Okay.
fine.
The remains were partially decomposed and buried in a shallow grave. The victim, later identified as 17-year-old Paula Golding, was a topless dancer and a sex worker, and she was from Anchorage, of course. She had gone missing some months earlier, and an autopsy revealed that she had been shot with a .223 caliber bullet, the same bullet that the investigators have found on the previous investigation.
Right. So now if alarms weren't going off before, now they have sort of some consistency with these murders happening. And now they're getting reports of, people attempting to abduct women. So they're starting to get a clue here.
Yeah, and they know that just because of this, they know that they have, just because of the bullets, they during the investigation, they'll run, samples on these and discover that they are the same person. So they come from the same gun. And so they understand that this is a serial killer that they are.
Right. They
with.
found 2 bodies. Well, they found 3 bodies, including Klutna Annie. But they found 2 bodies with the .223 caliber. So they're starting to have a trend showing here at the very least. Now, careful to not tip off the killer, they don't actually release this information to the public. They are worried, however, and they actually, at this point, start to look for help outside of Anchorage. Now, the FBI Investigative Support Unit actually sends out Special Agent John Douglas, who is a legendary figure in law enforcement, and he helps profile Alaska's latest serial killer. Many local investigators felt that Robert Hansen was still a viable suspect, and for good reasons, and they were pretty anxious to share their suspicions with Douglas. They actually didn't get to, though, because they didn't want to poison the well. So the FBI really didn't want to hear a whole lot of speculation from the Anchorage police, and they wanted to form their own opinions. Now, according to the FBI, they basically theorized that the perpetrator specifically chose sex workers and topless dancers because the majority of them were transients and they went unnoticed by the general public if they ever moved. Local investigators told the FBI about Hansen, and they began looking into Hansen's background. They took note of the fact that Hansen was of small stature, heavily pockmarked, and suffered from a severe speech impediment. Due to Hansen's unsightly looks, the FBI surmised that he suffered from severe skin problems as an adolescent and was probably teased by his peers. Now, in turn, they also said in their profile that the killer would have low self-esteem, which would have prompted him to live a pretty isolated life.
Yeah, in an isolated
Which
area.
wasn't too far off. They did pretty damn good on their profile, I have to say.
Exactly, and they even said that he might have a stutter, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he might have something like that.
Yeah,
I mean, I think they used the word stutter too. And so when the FBI told them that, and then they found out about it later or whatever, it was like, whoa.
Right.
It was
pretty
yeah,
spot on.
very accurate. So the FBI considered the abuse of sex workers a way for the perpetrator to get back at women. And I mean, this is exactly what we saw with the Green River, again, to bring up him for like the 4th time.
Right.
There's just a lot of similarities between the two. If Hansen were the killer, he was probably using them as a way to get his revenge, and this is what they say. So several investigators were familiar with Hansen and said that he was known around the area as a proficient hunter. The FBI surmise that Robert Hansen, tired of elk, bear, and Dall sheep, had instead turned his attention to more interesting prey. They told investigators that if Hansen was the killer, he was probably a saver and would keep small souvenirs from his victims, which, of course, we see all the time.
Yeah, very common.
I mean, if it's a serial killer, you can basically, it's not 100%, but most of them keep something,
Again, yeah, and that's like a token. They can look back and, it's almost like for them, they can go back in time to that place,
Exactly. Detective Glenn Floethy of the Alaska State Troopers had been part of a team investigating the discovery of several bodies in Anchorage. Floethy now had 3 bodies and what looked like one killer. Using this profile, Floethy investigated possible suspects until he reached Hansen, who fit the profile and owned a plane. And on October 27th, 1983, investigators followed Hansen to work and asked him to come with them to the police station for questioning. Hansen never bothered to ask why they wanted to talk to him and agreed to go along. At the same time, 2 groups of investigators served warrants on Hansen's house and plane. They found weapons throughout the house, but nothing to implicate Hansen in any of the murders. Right before they were calling it a day, one of the officers discovered a hidden space tucked away in the attic rafters. In there, they discovered a Remington 5.52 rifle, a Thompson Contender 7mm single-shot pistol, an aviation map with specific locations marked off, various pieces of jewelry, newspaper clippings, a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun, a driver's license, and various ID cards, some of which belonged to the dead women. As incriminating as these items were, the most important piece of evidence was found last: a .223 caliber Mini 14 rifle.
So they had their gun they had been looking for.
Exactly. They'd been looking for a .223 to put to these murders. And so all of this evidence that they found is pretty incriminating, obviously.
Yeah, totally. Now, when confronted with the evidence found in his home, I mean, obviously after this, they bring him to the police station. They have what they were looking for this whole time. And he denies it at first for quite a while. But eventually he would give in when confronted with the evidence, and he would try and blame the women to try and justify his motives. Now, eventually, after confessing to each item of evidence that was presented to him, he admitted to a spree of attacks against Alaskan women starting in 1971. Now, Hansen's earliest victims were young women, usually between 16 and 19, and not the sex workers who had led to the discovery.
Yeah, so he didn't hold out very long in interrogation. He just cracked under the pressure pretty quickly.
Right. Hansen even later explained that he never intended to kill any of his victims. He told them that as long as they complied with his every request, that they would stay alive. It was only after they tried to escape, Hansen would then gun them down. He apparently even let some of his victims go, as long as they promised to not tell anyone, basically, and report them to the police. The fact that he was hunting down his victims as sport is more likely a myth and was used for entertainment purposes. It's just, I mean, he never claimed that he was going through and like a most dangerous game type of situation where he's just hunting for the sport because he wanted to kill humans. That was sort of put forward by a lot of these true crime writers, and even I see it in documentaries a lot too.
Yeah, because that's the first thing that you see on the cover of a book or a magazine or any type of cover, really. You type in Robert Hansen and Robert Hansen Reddit into Google, and
Right.
all these Reddit things come up, and it's like everyone is, the title is, today I learned about a man named Robert Hansen who hunted women like animals, and it's like, okay, sort of, but not really. It's
Even when I sent it to you, I remember going like, "Dude, check this
yeah,
out! What the hell?
exactly.
Look at this guy!" It was so compelling, you know.
Yeah, it's way too compelling of a title to not use it whenever you can because it immediately catches the attention. But like you said, it's mostly for entertainment. I mean, that's why people. It's just a sort of a clickbait. I mean, he
It
did do
is.
all of these terrible things, but um, it's like he never intended to let them go and then hunt them down. As insane as that sounds, you know.
Right. So after his interrogation and him admitting to, committing these crimes, Hansen had his defense attorney Fred Dewey arrange a meeting with Anchorage DA Viktor Krum.
And if
And
anyone's a fan of Harry Potter, I have to mention that Viktor Krum. Anyways, if you read or watch Harry Potter, you'll know that name.
they also, they played a Quidditch match in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But during this meeting, Krum offered Hansen a deal in exchange for a full confession. And the DA guaranteed them that he would only be charged with the 4 cases that they knew of, and he would be able to serve his time in a federal facility rather than a maximum security institution. Hansen reluctantly agreed to the conditions, and he actually made his own stipulations as well. He said that the story couldn't be mass publicized, and he basically asked that they leave his family out of the completely, which is, I mean, understandable. Even for a monster who could, I mean, we're gonna go over the victim list here soon, but I mean, even for him, that says quite a bit.
So he pleaded guilty to the 4 homicides the police had evidence for, which was Morrow, Messina, Golding, and Eklutna Annie, and provided details about his other victims in return for serving his sentence in a federal prison, along with no publicity in the press. Another condition of the plea bargain was his participation in deciphering the markings on his aviation map and locating his victims' bodies. He indicated that he began killing in the early 1970s. He showed investigators 17 grave sites in and around south central Alaska, 12 of which were unknown to investigators, which is, it's a good thing that they were able to find these grave sites. The remaining marks on his map he refused to give up, including 3 in Resurrection Bay, near Seward. And authorities suspect 2 of these marks belong to the graves of Mary Thill and Megan Emmerich, who Hansen has denied killing. The remains of 12 victims were exhumed by the police and returned to their families. Hansen was sentenced to 461 years plus life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, so he took this deal, and this deal got him, like Stefan said earlier, this deal got him the ability to serve out his sentence in a federal prison instead of a maximum security prison. And it basically forced them to not release any information to the public, and that would keep his family safe. But I think it should be noted that at this time in Alaska, and to my knowledge, until today, I don't think they allow the death penalty. But especially at this time, the death penalty was not an option. Alaska became a state in 1959, and at that time, actually, around that time, the death penalty was banned. And so it's not like if he hadn't taken the plea deal, he wouldn't have been killed anyways. It's like he would have been fine. He got prison, he got life in prison without parole. So he's never, he's dead now, but he's never getting out.
Right.
And so that's just interesting. I guess the main reason for him taking the plea deal was to, like you said, keep his family safe. Because no publicity would have been let out, so no one in the public would have known who or where his family was.
Yeah, and for good reason. This guy did a lot of bad. As you mentioned earlier, Hansen did die in 2014. The reason he died was undisclosed, so we don't know exactly what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people in prison, if they have life sentences and they're not killed by other inmates or whatever, they they die of natural causes. I mean, or they die of cancer, or they die
Sure.
of just things that we die of. So who knows what it was? It was probably just a medical condition. If anyone finds information on that we may have missed out on, give us an email, like shoot us an email, and yeah, that'd be good.
Definitely. So I guess now, really, what I wanted to do, I compiled a list of the known victims, and I just sort of wanted to at least give them their time in the podcast, and you can really acknowledge how terrible this guy really was. So I'm gonna start here. Um, Lisa Futrell, who was 41. Now Hanson acknowledged that he committed this murder, and her body was actually found with Hanson's help. We have Malai Larson, who was 28, which again, Hanson admitted to, and her body was found as well. Sue Luna, who was 23, and the same story as before. Her body was found with Hanson's help. Tammy Peterson, who was 20, who Hanson admitted to. Angela Federn, who was 24. Again, Hanson acknowledged this as well, and her body was found. Teresa Watson, who the age was unknown, but he acknowledged to this murder as well. Delynn Frey, who was discovered on August 20th, 1985, by a pilot testing new tires on a sandbar of the Nick River, or Knik, I guess. Paula Goulding, who was acknowledged by Hanson. Her body was found, obviously. We talked about that. Andrea Altieri was admitted. Now, her body was not found, and this is probably due, we mentioned earlier, some of the bodies have been preyed upon by wildlife. Eklutna Annie. Now, Hanson also admitted to this as well, and her body was found, as we talked about earlier. However, her true identity was actually never discovered, and there had been huge attempts by the local, just people in the local area and police officers as well, trying to find out who she actually was, but as of now, we don't know. Jonah Messina, who we talked about earlier, Hanson admitted to her murder, and her body was found, obviously. The next victim was only known as Horseshoe Harriet. Now, this was acknowledged by Hanson as well, and he helped find the body. And this is another person who, unfortunately, their true identity was never discovered. Roxanne Eastland, who was 24, who Hanson admitted to again. Cecilia Van Zatine, who was 17. Now, we talked about this earlier. Hanson actually denied this, but it's suspected because of the X on the aviation map that Hanson actually did kill her. Now, the next victim was Megan Emmerich, who was 17, and this was also denied, but again, on his aviation map, there was an X, and but the body was never found. Mary Thill, who was 23, Hanson also denied, but again, there was an X on the map, and the body was never found as well. And as far as we know, that is, the most comprehensive list that I could find of the victims.
And of these 17 women, again, he was only formally charged with the murder of 4, which was Sherry Moreau, Joanne Messina, Eklutna Annie, who was never again identified, and Paula Goulding. And he was also charged with the kidnapping and rape of Cindy Paulson.
Right, which was the girl who got away.
Exactly. And so, again, he is dead now. He was sentenced, like we said, to life in prison without parole. And so he was never getting out, and he died in prison. And, this is just another story of, like I said earlier, it's kind of typical, and he really looked like it, but it's unfortunate that he was able to get away with killing so many people. I mean, he was only charged with 4 of the murders, but, that was a long list.
There was countless. I've even heard that the number of women that were not killed, but the number of women that were kidnapped by Hanson is even closer to 50. I've seen that number being thrown around.
Yeah, and
Now,
who
he
knows?
didn't kill but them obviously, or all 50, but he at least had raped and or kidnapped, maybe close to that as far as
Exactly.
we know.
Yeah, and who knows what he was doing in Iowa too? I mean,
I heard that too. I don't know. I thought about that as well. It really seemed like everything went downhill as soon as he got to Alaska, but who knows? It could have happened for sure.
most definitely. So yeah, that was episode 19 of the Strangeland podcast. Thanks again for joining us today. If you check us out on Facebook, just type in the Strangeland podcast. On YouTube, again, type in the Strangeland podcast. We're on iTunes, we're on Google Play, we're on Spotify now, we're on basically every podcast app. I don't think we're on Podbean yet. That's unfortunately my bad. We need to get on there. We'll be on there shortly. Send us an email about anything you want on to the strangelandpodcast at gmail.com. If you have some information that we may have missed, send us an email to that, and we will definitely, we'll get back to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this at the top of the show. Our YouTube page just hit 100 subs while we were on our break. We're up to 125 right now. So thank you, everybody, so much. Seriously, it means everything.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And what are we talking about next week? We mentioned it, but
Yeah, so we're gonna do Hinterkaifeck this coming week, I guess I should say. I can't wait. Should be a good one, man.
it's crazy, man. It's unsolved. It's a really, really weird story. I'm still doing research, but I have a couple theories. I don't know. There are a bunch of weird theories on that one, but it's definitely our most requested. We're still pretty small, so we haven't had a ton of requests yet, but we've had a few, and a lot. We've had at least 3 people request Hinterkaifeck out of the people that we have sent us emails. So that will be coming next week. Check us out.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.